So we will move on to Marcus Palumbo. When you're ready, sir.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Good afternoon, honorable members of the Planning and Development Committee. My name is Marcus Palumbo, and I have lived my whole life here in Connecticut, and I'm testifying in support of HB 6831, an act concerning transit-oriented communities. This is the fourth time I've come before this committee speaking in favor of transit-oriented communities, and my third time speaking in favor of essentially the same proposal. I'll admit I'm getting a little tired, but I keep coming back because I believe this is really important. This concept and this bill would do a lot to make Connecticut a more economically viable, affordable, and equitable place than it is today. Now, there are a whole host of benefits this proposal would have, but today I really want to focus on one impact of this bill that I believe hasn't been discussed as much, and that's actually the benefits that it would have for small towns. Now, when people conjure up images of classic New England charm, they usually picture a cute little historic downtown with shops on the sidewalk and apartments above. And yet today, it would be illegal to build something like this in many municipalities across Connecticut because so many of our towns have zoning laws that make it difficult or even impossible to build multifamily housing. And this has also contributed to the budget crises facing many of Connecticut's small towns. The parts of cities and towns that tend to be a net positive contribution to the tax revenue are typically the slightly denser little downtown areas with businesses and apartments, and the parts that are a net loss are the sprawling low density ones. Now, this is not to say that towns can't have low density housing, but it needs to be counterbalanced with a more economically productive downtown. But the problem is, many of our small towns don't have those little downtowns, and that's part of why so many of them are broke. And so this bill would help towns that opt in create those little downtowns for themselves or modify the ones that they already have in order to help better enable them to be financially independent. Now, many small towns in Connecticut do have transit services that would qualify them under this bill. For example, Plainfield, which is a small town in eastern Connecticut, has a bus route that stops at various destinations across town. And under this proposal, Plainfield could choose one of those stations and designate a TOD district around it, and then work with the state to enact zoning laws that promote multifamily and mixed-use housing. And in return, they would receive technical assistance and increased priority for grants to do just that. Now, this provides a fantastic opportunity for small towns to get the benefit of state funding. As has been previously mentioned, because Connecticut doesn't have a county level system for distributing grants, small towns often lose out to cities when it comes to receiving money from the state. And so this bill provides a path for small towns to get a leg up in that competition, all while keeping their small town charm. And additionally, towns that border a town with transit could make their own zoning districts and get these same benefits. There's a part of the bill that specifies this. And so a neighboring town that doesn't have a bus system could still designate some part of their town to have a TOD district around the town center and still be able to get this kind of assistance. So I have a little more to say, but it looks like I'm out of time. But basically, I believe this would be a really tangible step towards making Connecticut a more affordable place to be. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. And thanks for being so strict with your 3 minutes. Senator Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for testifying. Not only do I represent many small towns in Northeast Connecticut, not where Plainfield is, I know that very well, Plainfield, a little bit different than some of the other small towns in that part of the state, but also I was a planning and zoning commissioner, and the zoning regulations actually don't prevent towns from doing multi-family housing. I can tell you my town doesn't, and many of the towns I represent don't. The realities are on the ground, not having public sewer, public water, enough jobs, not having public transit. One of the reasons I'm looking to expand the pilot program for microtransit to be of help. But my question to you is, you mentioned about what can be done, for the multifamily housing. Do you have examples of any towns specifically that the zoning regulations have been shown to prevent multifamily housing where multifamily housing can go in?
Thank you for that question. And yeah, I will admit I have many friends in Woodstock, but I'm not familiar with their particular zoning code. But I think one of the biggest problems is when you have things like large minimum lot sizes, right, that require an acre or in some cases even like 2 acres to build a single family house. That extra land, well, some people might want it, and you certainly can have it if you want it. Developers can make land on that size plot. By having these restrictions that mean you have to have it, you add to the cost of what that land costs because land's expensive, right? So that's part of it. And then even for towns that do allow multifamily housing on paper, one of the problems has been previously mentioned is that the public hearing process for them can often be an impediment to making them happen. So we don't ask the same for someone wanting to build a single family home. They don't have to go through a public hearing, and yet you do if you want to build, you know, not a specific example, but something that's more than that. Maybe not a duplex, but something like that. Even not, I'm not talking about like giant apartment buildings here, just to be clear. Like I think one of the things that we struggle with is that because there is such a binary of we only ever see either very low density stuff or high rises, it's hard to even imagine what this kind of missing middle housing looks like. But it can be, I think what we need is to make sure we have architectural standards so that it fits in with the look and feel of the town. But I think the best way to do that is with those standards and not with a public hearing, because as has been previously mentioned, those can be pretty undemocratic. So I think a lot of towns, this is a bill that's supposed to help towns who already want to achieve these goals, but need a little help in doing it. And this is to provide them, help the state work with them to do that. At least that's how I see it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I still hadn't heard exactly which specific towns regulations stand in the way, but I think I did get my answer, and I've never seen a public hearing be anti-democratic. In fact, they can very much be democratic. And having held countless special permits and other public hearings in my role as a town official, we've always found that to be the case. But I appreciate you testifying and some of the points you raise. I do note, and I don't argue with some of them. I just wanted to mention that some of what's been said about some of the processes and zoning regulations don't actually match what goes on where the regulations are actually being done. So I encourage people to come out to the towns and actually see it in process. I think you'll take away something very different from what we hear. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
And I would also think, Senator, it depends on the town. Your town of 8,000 may do it differently than other towns as well. So I think I'm sure you were an unbelievably good member of your planning and zoning, but not every town maybe is doing it the same way.
And I appreciate that. And I think all the towns can certainly always strive to do things better. We always know a learning process, but we
Yep.
can't paint the towns in a big, broad brush. But on the other hand, when there are towns that can use the help, always looking to provide them. Absolutely. Thank
Absolutely.
you, Madam Chairwoman.
Absolutely. Representative Dubitsky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for coming in. I very much appreciate your testimony. Obviously, the effect laws like this would have on small towns is one of the things that I am particularly interested in. And in fact, I do represent the town of Plainfield, and I'm sitting here with the town of Plainfield's zoning regulations in front of me, and multifamily housing is allowed in almost every district. In fact, there are not only is multifamily housing allowed, but accessory dwelling units are allowed with either above a commercial building or separately. And there are some restrictions, like they have to meet the building and fire and public health codes, and no more than 2 bedrooms are permitted per accessory dwelling unit, and no more than 2.5 bathrooms per accessory dwelling unit, etc. But you used Plainfield as an example of where it would be helpful. They have it already. And Plainfield is, when it comes to small towns, a rather big small town compared to some of my other towns. How would a law like this benefit a town like Hampton or Scotland or Chaplin, which have less than a tenth of the people that live in Plainfield?
Thank you. That's a really great question, and I think there's a lot of important stuff in there. So first, to your point about the existing regulations in Plainfield, Obviously, I don't know the details, but I would say if what you're saying is true, that's great. And I think that puts Plainfield in a position to benefit from this bill, because if they're already doing things like that, then that's one less step that they have to take in order to uh, kind of create a district and that would have the general priorities that would get them priority for these grants and stuff. So I think that's fantastic, and that's exactly what we want to see. Is we want to see towns that are either thinking of doing this or have already put in the work. We want to say we'll help you and we'll give you the assistance that you need to do that. And I do want to just, as an aside here, say that I think there's been a lot of discussion about the different grants involved. And from my understanding of it, it's pretty narrowly tailored to be just the kind of stuff that you would want to use for transit-oriented development, right? Expanding sidewalks and main streets and such. But to your other question about neighboring towns, because I think that is an important point, that while some small towns have transit and maybe more than you'd expect, you generally, not you personally, but like it can be surprising that some do, but even ones that don't. So for example, I think Canterbury is next to Plainfield, and it doesn't, as far as I know, have any transit, but because there's a provision in the bill that qualifies what they call a transit adjacent community, they would be able to have the benefits of this bill as well, even though they don't have transit themselves. So the difference would be, in this case, instead of centering the district around a particular bus or train station, it would be centered around like a little main street area or a downtown. And so, and I think the other important point to emphasize here is that unlike previous versions of this bill that stated that the TOD district had to meet certain density requirements or whatever, one of the things I really like about this bill is that it leaves it open so that the coordinator, what's been termed the zoning czar, but I think that's a little bit of a loaded term. I think the idea is that this person and this committee would work with the town. They'd work with Canterbury and say, okay, what do you need? What is reasonable for you to do specifically? Because I don't think anyone's suggesting, putting in like giant skyscrapers in Canterbury, and I'd have a word with them if they were. So I think this bill to me seems to strike a good balance of working with towns instead of it being a sort of top-down mandate, if that makes sense.
Why does the state need to be involved at all? Why can't Canterbury just decide we want to have an area where we're going to have accessory dwellings as of right? Towns do that all the time. Why does the state need to come in and force it?
Well, first off, I don't think they're forcing it. I believe it's because it's opt-in and because it's not taking away anything. It's just offering opportunities and funding to help do that. I don't think, if anything, I just think it's a benefit for towns that want to do that. But you are right. Towns can and do change their zoning regulations all the time. I think where this becomes in particular to be a help for the town is, one, funding, grants, getting priority for that, which, as I mentioned, is something small towns often have trouble competing for. But then also the planning assistance, because just making something say you can have accessory dwelling units, that's not hard. But like designing a transit-oriented district in a downtown area, I've heard when I've talked to people around the state and local government, like it can be difficult to even have the expertise necessary to make those plans at a small town level, because sometimes there just isn't the resources. And so I think it's not that they need help. We're not saying every town needs help, but if a town wants it, this bill provides them an avenue to get it.
But don't they already have that with the COGS?
I'm sorry?
Don't they already have that expertise with the planning districts, with the COGS? Like Canterbury is part of NECOG, the Northeast Connecticut Council of Governments. They have all the resources they need with regard to design, engineering, anything they want. Why does the state need to come in? And if the state is prioritizing people who opt in, that means it's deprioritizing those towns that don't opt in. So it's a heavy hand.
So firstly, on the last point, I disagree that it is necessarily deprioritizing other towns, because what we've heard is that the kind of the comparative example here of what happens without this bill is a lot of towns just never get the chance for the grants at all because it's really competitive. And so this gives the towns a way to do that. And then also what I think is important and maybe has been missed in this conversation is that we're not talking about, dozens and dozens of grants. We're talking about, with one or two exceptions, we're talking about grants that are narrowly tailored for the kind of development that this bill is talking about, like transit-oriented stuff. And so what I don't understand is, it seems to me that if you're a town and if you're a town that would be wanting to use one of these grants, then you would want to be using it for this purpose. And so you'd be able to opt into the bill. So I don't think it's taking away from towns doing anything other than this. But with respect to the COGS, obviously they play an important role given our lack of county level government. But of course, we can't rely on them from everything. I mean, they're not government. They're not government agencies. They're people who work for them are not elected. And that's not to say that they don't represent the people in those communities. But I think that we shouldn't just rely on them to provide that assistance when we as the state and you all as the legislature can kind of prompt that in a way that is derived through your authority as elected representatives, is more ultimately representative of the people at large and what they want.
Okay, the synonym of prompt is force, which is what this is. But I appreciate your opinion. When I see you next year testifying on the same bill, I will again explain to you how this is not going to help any of the small towns. And perhaps next time you come up with an example that you've read the zoning regulations on, and if you do it on a town that I represent, I can assure you I will already have known if you've got it right. But I thank you for coming in, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. And God willing, and the creek don't rise, maybe this is the last time we hear it because we get it through both chambers instead of just one. Moving on to our next person. Thank you so much for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Tanner Thompson, you're up next.